What you're getting today is what I've found from my own researches. And the particular Camelot we're talking about is one of the sites that initiated my Earth stars discovery 20 years ago. So I've been accumulating the facts on this for the last 20 years, and I finally got round to doing something with them. As you can see from that, we're talking about a place in North London, and it was actually the very centre of the Plantagenet King's royal hunting ground, Enfield Chase.
Where in North London?
Oh yes, I'll be coming to that, obviously. Some of you may be aware of this sort of thought. The Arthurian legends, I think, were the Da Vinci Code of their time, and they caught the imagination of the spirit of the times. And they embody a living mystery tradition that's specific to Britain, and it's knowledge that is encoded in the landscape and the sacred sites. And those of you who are involved in traditional spiritual paths of these islands, the Druid tradition or the Western mystery tradition, will be aware of that because it's something that's taught in those streams of knowledge. Yes, I've got. So we come to there are lots of Camelots. I'm not saying this is exclusively the Camelot, and none of the others are any good. There are Camelots all over the place, and one of them was in Essex, where in fact Colchester bore the name, pre-Roman name Camelodunum, and was that's as close to the Celtic name for Camelot as you get. So it has a strong claim to the idea of Camelot. Thomas Mallory in the Mort d'Arthur seemed to be convinced that Camelot was Winchester, although when Caxton printed it for him, Caxton put in his own notes to say, "Don't be daft, everybody knows it's in Wales." Or, not those exact words, but I think that's what he meant. And he meant Caerleon, the city of the legions. John Leyland was Henry VIII's antiquarian, and he was the first person to suggest that it might be Cadbury Castle in Somerset, which he got from local folklore from the nearby villages. And then, of course, there's Tintagel down in Cornwall, which is one of the Camelot locations that captures popular imagination. But Geoffrey Ashe, who's one of the leading authorities on the Arthurian mysteries, regards Camelot as a mythical place that doesn't exist physically, that it's a visionary place. And he actually is quoted as saying that it can't be found on any map, but unfortunately, poor old Geoffrey, I'm going to have to disprove that today for him. Because we come to this map I found in a local history book of Enfield. It clearly shows a place called Camelot right in the middle of what was the royal hunting ground of the Plantagenet King's, Enfield Chase. And it's a slightly different map from the same book, but Camelot is very prominent in it. In fact, there were 5 lodges for the hunting ground, each of them positioned in the 4 quarters: North Lodge, South Lodge, East Lodge, West Lodge, and Camelot was the central one. Prior to the Norman conquest, this land was in the hands of somebody called Ansgar, whose title was Stalker to the King. which was kind of like a field marshal. He was in charge of the armies, and he, on behalf of Harold, staged the defences of London and marched with an army of men from London to Hastings to get duffed up by William the Conqueror. Because of his role as being in charge of the defences of London, this is very likely a strategic military position from Roman times, one of the outer defensive positions of the city. And that's not just my opinion, that's, again, that's something I've got from one of the local historians. This is where it is today. This is Trent Park in Cockfosters, which is at the far end of the Piccadilly line, so you can now get to Camelot on the tube. And Cockfosters tube's there. You come out of the station and turn right, walk up, and then through the park. And Camelot is hidden in woods on the north side. We'll come to what it looks like in a minute. These are some photographs of it. It's almost square, moated island at the moment, in woodland, and it's been neglected for years, so the woodland has spread to the island itself. And I guess it's about 60 to 80 yards square. That's the southeast corner. Let's see what else we've got. That's turned out very, very dark, unfortunately. What you can nearly see there is an old hornbeam tree on the corner of the moat, which is known locally as the Merlin tree. And I haven't been able to find out why it's called the Merlin tree, although if you visit the place, there are lots of spots around the moated island where there's a very distinct presences, and I assume somebody finds that there's a Merlin presence by this tree. That's the north side of the moat. As you can see, it's quite wide, and in the winter it gets pretty deep, but in the summer it dries up, and it's a moat of mud during the summer months. Some disreputable knights there. The official opinion about this place is that the name Camelot there, and it's today it's been abbreviated to Camlet Moat, C-A-M-L-E-T, but another local historian is on record as saying that the name here was very definitely Camelot originally, and that at this location it's of Celtic origin, which puts the place, at least 2,000 years back. But the local historians seem to think that the name Camelot doesn't have any particular significance and isn't directly connected to anything else Arthurian. And they put up information boards at the place which carry that opinion. But the notice boards that they put up are so littered with errors and mistakes in dates and all sorts of basic errors that they're more like misinformation boards. One of them even has an illustration of it of a standard Saxon homestead moat with a little tiny thatched cottage on it and a tiny wooden walkway across the moat, and it totally ignores all the archaeological evidence which has been found there, which I'll come to later. Other people believe that it was simply a keeper's lodge from the time of Enfield Chase, but that's not entirely correct either, because the keeper's lodge there didn't arrive until the 1400s. So here we come to what was found there in terms of archaeology, and both of the excavations here were done amateurishly by the people who owned this as a country estate, as an estate. And the first one was the Bevan family in the 1880s, The Trent Park was then the home of John Lee Cooper Bevan, who was one of the founders of Barclays Bank. And his wife and his daughter Nesta were obsessed with the Camelot moat place that they found on their property, and they wanted to go and dig there. And they rounded up the gardeners and took them up there and did their own excavations. And amongst the things they found were stone walls 5.5 feet thick, which is fairly substantial, a subterranean dungeon complete with a chain still attached to the wall, a massive drawbridge 38 feet in length supported on oak timbers a foot square, and decorative wall tiles depicting a knight on horseback. And there were also sandals, a dagger, and coins from the Roman period found, again, which points to the antiquity of this place, going back right to the Roman times and to Celtic times before that. The second excavation was done by Sir Philip Sassoon, who was he was kind of like the Peter Mandelson of his day in the 20s. He was a bit shifty behind the scenes, and he was present at the excavation of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1923, and he must have got carried away by what he saw there and what was brought out of that excavation, because he went straight home and organised an excavation of Camelot Moat, which I think it was him that turned up the sandals and daggers and the Roman coins, he again unearthed the flint walls and found that there were over 74 feet of this wall across the moat, and that the building there had been quite substantial. The reports in the local Enfield paper said that his excavation ditches took the form of a star, which prompted some people to think there was some occult significance to his excavations, but there's no other explanation of that, and the remains there at the moment don't recognisably look like any sort of star pattern.
And why did British Heritage cover them up?
Because there were people turning up with metal detectors overnight digging things up, so they filled in the trenches and put a protective sheeting over them. And there was also a well in the northeast corner, which, according to the reports on the excavations, had a tiled floor to it at that time, but it doesn't any longer. This is one of the misinformation boards with the illustrations of little thatched cottages, and somewhere on there's a tiny little wooden bridge. So they've totally ignored a 38-foot drawbridge and flint stone walls, 5.5 feet thick. The Sassoon excavation actually said that there were huge stones in amongst the foundations of the walls as well, and that some of the flints were as big as a man's head. It doesn't say how big the biggest stones were, but some of them sounded pretty substantial. So you could have a bit of wild speculation about a megalithic monument. So we come to the question of who named it Camelot, because it's definitely called Camelot, and unfortunately, or ironically, the earliest record of the name is when it was demolished. Camelot Manor, as it was referred to, was demolished in 1439, and the quote there is taken from a local historian's book on the history of Enfield Chase. The remains of Camelot Manor were taken down and the material sold and employed towards the repair of Hertford Castle. So, as that was when it was demolished, it must have existed for some time prior to 1439, and just to make a parallel with the Arthurian romances, Thomas Malory's Morte d'Arthur came out was completed in 1469 to 70 and not actually printed until 1485. So the name Camelot here was in use before the works of Sir Thomas Malory. And as you probably all know, there are lots of earlier Arthurian romances from French, from Chrétien de Troyes. But local folklore tells us that the Camelot name predates them as well. The earliest mention of Camelot in any of the Chrétien de Troyes work is 1170. And this place seemed to have been called Camelot before then, if local legend is to be believed, because also in the same book by David Pam, it tells us from a survey in 1656 that the manor and chase of Enfield were at that time in the possession of Sir Geoffrey de Mandeville in the reign of William the Conqueror, whose seat and habitation at that time, called Camelot, was situated on the chase near Potter's Lodge, which doesn't exist anymore. And the ruins thereof are yet remaining, and being moated is to this day called Camelot Moat. So according to that, this was called Camelot way back in the time of William the Conqueror, who died in 1087. So that predates Chrétien de Troyes' work by 100 years. So as it says at the bottom there, it's beginning to look as if the name Camelot was not drawn from any of those sources, or and was particular to this place. At least one local historian has said that the name here is of Celtic origin, which puts it in a time scale of being a pre-Roman site. And that means that the place could have been called Camelot at a time when a real King Arthur was supposedly in existence in the 5th and 6th centuries. This is the map from the survey in the 1600s, which the quote about Geoffrey de Mandeville was taken from, and it's very interesting. It's a poor quality map, but that's where Camelot is, and it shows that Camelot wasn't just that little moat, because around it there is West Camelot, there's South Camelot and Camelot Hill, there's North Camelot and East Camelot. So the whole area was Camelot, quite a considerable area. At least half of what is now now Trent Park is or was originally part of this Camelot estate. So we're not talking about just a little moated island with a fortified manor house or small castle on it. It's a whole piece of territory. And this is just a timeline to give us the logic and the facts of what we found out so far. That the origins are unknown, but remains suggest it was occupied from Celtic and Roman times, and prior to the Norman conquest was in the hands of the king's right-hand man and the head of his armies, which suggests it was a place of some military significance. And then with the invasion of William the Conqueror, Ansgar's lands and manor were given to Sir Geoffrey de Mandeville the Elder, and passed to his son William, and then to his grandson, who was another Sir Geoffrey de Mandeville, and then to the de Mandeville's descendants, who were the de Bohun's. And there's a record of Humphrey de Bohun fortifying his manor house in 1347, and the drawbridge timbers date from around that time. So it's likely that the manor house of the de Bohuns was Camelot Manor, and that he probably installed the moat and the drawbridge if they weren't there before. Maybe he renewed something that was there earlier. It's interesting, again, there's a strong link to royalty with this site, in that it was the royal hunting ground. and the original owners was the head of the Harold's armies, and his successor was one of William the Conqueror's right-hand men. But another link is that one of Humphrey de Bohun's daughters, Mary, married Henry Bolingbroke, who later became Henry IV. So this is a place that was known to the kings and queens of Britain in medieval times. And it's the fact that nobody knows about it now and that it's passed into obscurity doesn't reflect how important it may have been in the past. This is one of the remains of the excavations that were done in the 1920s. You can just about see that's about a 6 or 7 feet wide trench, and up until 10 years ago you could see the remains of the flint walls at the bottom of that before English Heritage covered them over to protect them. And the guys with the metal detectors still turn up there. I found 2 up there last week and shooed them away. This is the location of the drawbridge on the western side of the moat. It's slightly wider than the moat area because it's been dug out to get the beams out, and it's on the opposite side of the current entrance. So just to recap on the facts so far, the name's indisputably Celtic, so could date back 2,000 years. And actually less than half a mile away from here is another sacred site whose names link it to a Celtic Romano deity of the same era, the god Nodens. That's down near the centre of Trent Park. It's only visible on old maps now as Nodens Well, because they seem to have, with typical respect for our ancient sites and heritage, they've built over it, and the original site of it's no longer obvious, but it's on old maps. Recapping, the archaeological finds include Roman remains from almost 2,000 years ago, so the place could have been in use during the time of a real Arthur, who was supposedly a 5th century warlord. And it may have been an important location for the outer defences of London, which would have been known to any warrior king worth his salt. Remains have been found that suggest a substantial stone building. We've no idea when this dated from, but its massive drawbridge was dated to the medieval period, and the stone walls may be older. Whatever it was called Camelot Manor and demolished in 1439. We also know that a couple of years later, in 1441, a modest hunting lodge was built on the site, and that the place, as the royal hunting ground, as the centre of the royal hunting ground, has always had strong connections to royalty. So it's not a mythical Camelot. This came as much as a surprise to me as anyone else to find that it is actually a real Camelot. Whether it was ever Arthur's Camelot is open to debate, but it's certainly a place that's as magical and mysterious as the legendary Camelot, because it's one of the locations that led me to the Earth Star's discovery, which is a geometric pattern linking the sacred sites all around London. And this was one of the key sites that started it, and it's a place with a very special presence and atmosphere. And it's a place of inspiration, vision, and has a healing power to it as well. A lot of people believe the well there was originally a healing well. So we come to the mystical dimensions, the Arthurian synchronicities, and it has connections with secret societies and the secret tradition in Arthurian legend. It has connections as a place of initiation and a possible Celtic sacred site and an oracular shrine. It's a major junction point of ley lines and earth energies. It has apparitions of a white lady, who's the Lady of Camelot Moat, or the Grail Maiden of the Holy Well. And we'll just show you a few of those things. This is one of the Arthurian synchronicities. This, theoretically, is a cross found on King Arthur's grave in Glastonbury in 1191 by the monks. It was a lead cross with an inscription in Latin that says, "Here lies King Arthur in the Isle of Avalon." And weirdly, when I was first investigating the Camelot moat, this was one of the odd Arthurian synchronicities that came up around the same time, that someone in Enfield found an identical lead cross a couple of miles from Camelot moat at a place called Forty Hall, when the council were dredging a pond there. And he took it to the British Museum to have it assessed, and they couldn't tell him whether it was genuine or not because there wasn't anyone on duty the day he took it in. He refused to leave it with them. But the local paper picked up the story and wrote an article on it. Because where he'd found it was land belonging to Enfield Council, they issued a writ against him to hand over this cross that they said he'd found on their property. And a lot of people believed that the cross was a fake, was something that he made. But he went to Pentonville for 2 years. And I don't think you'd do that for something if you knew it was a fake. You just give it them, wouldn't you? But the whereabouts of that cross is still a mystery now, because the chap who found it, a man called Derek Mahoney, actually committed suicide a few years later, and he said that he'd hidden the cross again back in the landscape where it belonged and refused to tell anyone where it was. He said it was whether it was found again was for nemesis, fate.
Probably put it in a different horror.
Yes, well, that'd be sensible, wouldn't it? Okay, so that's the first weird Arthurian synchronicity. This is the remains of the well, which may have been a sacred spot or an oracular shrine. This is my opinion of it, that it was a Celtic oracular shrine and a holy well. It's purely from a sort of psychic vision I had of a procession of ladies coming from another site nearby and looking after this well, and basically being a Celtic oracular place where you'd go for a vision, or to divine the future in some way, or for healing, or for guidance. Incidentally, the Nodens well, which is not far away, is also linked to similar sort of activities, because the only other the best known place in Britain associated with the Celtic god Nodens is in Lydney in Gloucestershire, and the temple there was a healing, a dream temple where people would go and sleep overnight to have a dream given to them by the god, and that's 300 yards from here, so it could be a similar thing. It's a shame that the picture's not very clear, but the tree to the right of the well has become, over the last 10 or 15 years, a rag tree with people tying blessings on it. It's an old English tradition. Well, it's all over the world. There's lots of them in Ireland. There's some down in Cornwall, some in Wales. Strange creature there is Maddie, border collie. So carry on. That's a close-up of some of the rags tied on the tree next to the well. Enfield Council are particularly bad with sacred sites because they tried to come and chop the tree down. They claimed that it was dangerous and could fall on someone who might sue them. And they didn't reckon with the fact that the wood, the tree surgeon they employed to cut it down was actually a member of the Pagan Federation, and he organised for a bunch of witches to turn up and have a demonstration to stop him cutting it. So, this is the rag tree at the Swallowhead Spring in Avebury, just to show you where these other traditional places are. The well at Camelot Moat has got a strange tale that there was treasure at the bottom of it. Originally it was a brick-lined well and quite nice, but now it's just this muddy hole because obviously somebody tried to dig out the treasure. The prime suspect is Sir Philip Sassoon, who was his whole excavation seemed to be looking for treasures of one sort or another. So they wrecked the well in the process and didn't find the treasure. But treasure in the well could mean spiritual treasure. And there's also another very odd tale linked to this well, which involves the death of Sir Geoffrey de Mandeville, who the tale goes that because he was a bit of a bugger in the war between King Stephen and his sister Matilda, and he swapped sides depending on who was paying the most, and eventually ended up on King Stephen's side, who made him Earl of Essex and gave him a lot of dosh. But the legend is that at the time that he was on the run from the king's forces, he hid on Camelot Moat and dropped his treasure down the well to hide it, and hid in a hollow oak tree. But at midnight he came out and in the dark fell down the well to his death. And there's some strange elements in that, because if it was a full moon it wouldn't have been particularly dark. And it combines some elements that sound like an initiation of the full moon, of the oak tree, of the sacred well. And it certainly wasn't his death, because he's on record as being killed by an arrow to the head at the Battle of Burwell Castle in 1144, and he died in Mildenhall a couple of days later. So the whole story of his death is a fabrication, but it does sound like a ritual death, an initiation of some sort, in association with the well. And as far as I know, the only other well that are supposed to have been used for initiatory practices is the Chalice well, where there's an underground chamber in the stonework beneath the well, in the Chalice Well Gardens. Which again is another Arthurian site. This is just reiterating what I said at the beginning, that the Arthurian legends contain teachings of a pre-Christian mystery tradition which is still taught in Western mystery schools and in certain Druid orders. Sir Geoffrey de Mandeville also had very weird connections to the Templars. On his death in 1144. He was said not to be a Templar, but a party of Templars rode out from London to collect his body from Lincolnshire, and they took it back to the temple grounds, and because he wasn't, he'd been excommunicated, they couldn't bury him. They put him in a lead coffin and hung him in an apple tree for 19 years, which is there's another weird thing, isn't it? And if you've been to the Temple Church, there are effigies of Knights Templars in the round church, and considering he was said not to be a Templar, he's one of them. Sir Geoffrey de Mandeville, he's one of the Templars who was honoured with a burial in the Temple Church, and that was normally reserved for very important or very special Templars, because the Temple Church to them was as good as being buried in Jerusalem itself. So he was certainly at the root of some mysteries. This is another connection to a society called it's generally known as the Golden Dawn. But I found this map in a book by Gareth Knight called The Secret Tradition in Arthurian Legend, which obviously, as soon as I saw that, I bought it. But it shows a map of Europe with Camelot in the area of London. And Charles Williams turned out to have been a member of the Society of the Golden Dawn, which it is said to be a secret society, but it's one of the most well-known secret societies there is, I should think. And it, as well as showing Camelot in London, it shows the spirit of the land as a woman overlaying it, which is one of the key factors associated with the tradition in Arthurian legend, the goddess of sovereignty. These are some interesting shots from the moat. That's a ceremonial circle that was beside the moat in the 1990s, which was used by various groups for ceremonies. And it was used for Druid ceremonies too, from the order which I belong to. Over the last 10 years, the moat has become a sacred site in itself, and people turn up and do all sorts of weird things there. Somebody has built this shrine, which was built around a little altar with a statue of Athena Minerva on it. Lots of people also built these little bender shelters, which some of them used for sitting in and meditating, some set up as altars. Unfortunately, some people just go along, sit in them and smoke dope and have a beer. At one point there were about 10 of these on the little moated island, but it's down to about 4 now. That's one of the larger ones. Sorry, I'm in your way. And these are other odd curiosities about the place. There's a weird symbol carved on one of the trees. I don't know whether you can see that. That's a face that somebody has carved on one of the dead trees as well. And there's a sort of big dream catcher there, which is about 2 feet long, that's been hung in that tree. And there's at the base of this particular tree, there's a little cherub and some crystals, but that's the kind of thing that you find going on up there, and I think I'm probably partly responsible for most of this. When I wrote the Earth Stars book, it attracted people to the site, and they found the atmosphere there useful for what they were doing, and created lots of little interesting shrines and things because of it. These are a couple of the nicer things that turned up there. Somebody with particularly artistic ability started making landscape art out of stones and things. And that's an example of 2 of them. I'm going to have to get a move on because the time's running out. So there's just some more of the landscape art that turned up there. And this was a very odd thing. The guy on the left is a holy man from southern India called Atma Chaitanya, and he had back in the 90s he said he had a vision from the other side of the world that called him to this place, and he's got a load of followers in Hackney, and they brought him over here. One of them knew me and told me when they were going, so I went along to see what they were doing, and they did a very involved Hindu ceremony beside the well, in which the holy man put this guy into a trance and was asking him questions. I got no idea what they said because they were speaking in their own language. but it was very interesting. His followers still turn up there from time to time, and you can always tell when they've been, because there are rose petals scattered all over the place, and incense wrappers with Indian addresses on. And one of the things he said that he saw at this place was a Sanskrit Om in the bark of one of the trees, and it was there. It's now grown out. But he did say that beneath the ground there were huge stones, which he thought was a megalithic monument. So that's an example of the weirdness that goes on. And we come to another bit of the weirdness. It's a shame the picture's so dark. That's a statue of a Virgin Mary statue that was placed at the base of a tree on the moated island and left there for several months as a symbol of Our Lady of Camelot Moat, although you wouldn't want to drink the water from the well, because I think it'd have the opposite effect to the healing springs. And there's been lots of odd photographs taken here with orbs on and different other shapes, but this is the most unusual because it looks to me like an apparition that I once saw there. A mysterious blob of light. It wasn't taken by me, it was taken by an old lady who walks a dog there. And I think she was actually trying to photograph a woodpecker or something. And she certainly didn't see anything out of the ordinary when she took that photograph. Which brings us to the question of what the White Lady image is there that people have been seen, and the Grail is inextricably bound up with visions and apparitions of ladies. The bearer of the Grail is always a maiden, the goddess. And the essence of the tradition in the Arthurian legends is that that the service to the lady spoken of by the knights is actually a continuation of a cult of the white goddess, and who represents the soul and the spirit of the land. So it's the deeper significance of it is service to the goddess of the land, the feminine, divine aspect. We've already done that. Robert Graves was clearly aware of this, and in the opening of the White Goddess book, he has this quotation that it's a poet's privilege and fate to fall enamoured of the one muse who variously haunts this island earth. He's well aware that the White Goddess is the earth spirit, and because the way we are as a collective consciousness, the way she manifests to us varies through culture and age. And so she's going to look like Virgin Mary apparitions or the goddess Sophia, depending on which culture you come from. This is how the pre-Raphaelites saw her. Incidentally, this is Our Lady of Lourdes up here, and when I was swatting up on apparitions of Virgin Marys, I found that Bernadette Subaru, who's the girl who first saw the apparition of Our Lady at Lourdes, actually referred to her as the White Lady initially, and it was only when she spoke to the village priest that it became the Blessed Virgin Mary. Prior to that, it was she just seen it as a white lady. This particular one is very similar to an apparition that I saw at the moat, but I've also seen her there looking very like a Guinevere figure. And the park rangers there tell me that dog walkers have reported seeing a white lady drifting across the path nearby too. And as I said, these things are linked to a tradition which is encoded in the land. This knowledge is built into the land, and it's a living tradition which all of us can access. Should we want to dabble with such things. And in the past, this understanding of the goddess of the earth and goddess of the land was incorporated in lots of mystery traditions. This is how the alchemist Robert Flood saw her as the anima mundi, the world soul or earth spirit, and that's the card that represents her in the tarot, which has very strong links to the Grail. The picture on the left is the Russian mystic Nicholas Roerich. His picture of the mother of the world, which is another name for the anima mundi, the world soul. And this is again a pre-Raphaelite of the Goddess and the Grail by Dante Gabriel Rossetti in the pre-Raphaelite period. The Grail is always linked to the goddess, and it's tied in too with the dove, which is often depicted flying into the Grail glass. And even Guinevere herself is a thinly disguised version of the white goddess. In Welsh, Gwyn means white or bright. And the second half of her name is open to dispute, and most etymologists would tell you it just means beautiful or smooth. But there's also a word from our Druidic traditions, nuevra, which means the animating spirit of life, and it's also the word that gives us, in French, vivre, and also the dragon force, because it's the woivre or the wyvern, the serpent energy, and she's therefore the planetary life force, soul and spirit of the land. And also in Welsh, Gwenna means Venus and Friday. And I don't think people look at these things with a spiritual perspective, because well, or maybe it's just I hadn't noticed that myself. Gwenna would lead Ver. Ver is also an ancient British goddess, a river goddess. It's and the name of the river that runs through St Albans. Be about another 5 minutes. Is that all right, Giles? Sorry, I'm running a bit slow here. Nowhere is the connection between the spirit and the land and the Grail spelled out more clearly than in the Arthurian romance of the Elucidation, which is an anonymous addition to Chrétien de Troyes' Percival, but it wasn't added as an afterthought. It was seen to be so important they'd put it in as an anonymous foreword, as a prologue. And basically what the Elucidation says is that long ago the land was blessed with abundance and fertility due to the enchantment of the maidens of the wells, who possessed and were keepers of the Grail. And throughout every realm, every sacred well or spring had a guardian who was a Grail maiden, and to each and every passing traveller she offered the sacred waters in a golden cup. And the Grail, this tale says that these were the waters of life and inspiration, and the hidden life force offering more than thirst-quenching refreshment. And as well as guardians of the wells and springs, the maidens were the voices of the sacred waters. They were oracles, so they may not have been bodily women, but otherworldly spirits of place. And under the protection, the aegis of the Grail maidens, all was well and the land was fertile, until along came King Amangon, who, according to the tale, was a lecherous, greedy lout who raped one of the Grail maidens and stole her sacred chalice and enslaved her as a serving wench. And that brought bad luck on the land, and the life-giving waters dried up, and the oracular voices of the wells were never heard of again. And the maidens of the wells withdrew themselves and their magical guardianship from the world. And I think that represents a time we've gone through where our ability to see these spirits of the land, spirits of place, and interact with them and their places of inspiration. It goes right back to the time when we did that as a matter of course because of our connections to the collective consciousness of the land and ourselves, and we've lost it in recent times with modern with the development of modern technology and the Industrial Revolution and individual consciousness. But because of my experiences at Camelot Moat, I see it, the link with the Grail Maidens very strongly as to places like the well there, where in a place where there's a great atmosphere and an inspiring atmosphere, you can still sense the presence of these beings and their energies and gain inspiration from them. And in working with this over the last few years, I've got the distinct impression too that the Grail Maidens are returning not just to the places like Camelot Moat, but to all the fountains and wells and springs and ponds, and that a process of healing the wasteland has begun. And this is particularly important for the concept of fountain, I think, because these are healing influences that link in with the fountain concept. And when we go to a sacred well or a spring, if we invoke the goddess of the waters to take back her control and the power of it, we help that energy to rebuild itself into the land, and you help that energy to re-establish itself on a level that other humans can communicate with, because you're making a connection with it to the human level, which they can then use later with other people. And the more people that invoke the return of the Grail Maidens at the sacred wells and springs, the more likely they are to be seen by others. So I think that's I'm going to have to finish here. There's also the idea that this Camelot is linked to a round table, which is the Earth Stars geometry of London. Vast pattern links sacred sites across the city. And it's like the round table of the original Camelot. It's there because it's a structure of harmony, except this is not harmony between the knights. This is geometric harmonies, and it has 21 different patterns all overlaid in perfect harmony. That's the most complicated of them. These are various other spots where you might find a Grail Maiden. Chalice Well. This is a holy well in Tottenham, which surprised me because I didn't know there were holy wells in Tottenham until I started working with the Earth Stars. This is a holy well in Hanwell, and we've got a couple of the guardians of it here, Joan and John Taplin, who the Hanwell Fountain Group, who've been working with it for years. It's a beautiful place. This is the Victoria Memorial Fountain outside Buckingham Palace, which is on the main north-south line of Earth Stars. This is a well on the green at Rottingdean, which is where the Earth Stars north-south line hits the channel. That's Westminster Cathedral, which has a well dedicated to Mary Magdalene beneath the forecourt, again sadly buried, but I'm sure you could conjure the Grail Maiden up from beneath it. I'm going to have to whiz through this, but this is an alignment of the Earth Stars pattern on which I believe the stone that Arthur pulled the sword of sovereignty was positioned. It's a midsummer sunrise line that links the King's Stone at Kingston-on-Thames, the site of coronation of 7 Saxon kings, with Westminster Abbey, our current site of coronations, and St Paul's, which had an open-air moot where an open-air vote was taken on who got crowned at St Paul's. If you didn't get voted to be king, the next king at the open-air Druidic moot there, which was like the open-air Parliament at Parliament Hill, if you weren't voted in there, you didn't get crowned at Westminster. And most of the Plantagenet kings submitted to that open-air election for their coronation. But Thomas Mallory said that Arthur drew the sword from a stone in the churchyard of the greatest church in London, which is St Paul's, and the moot at the open air moot and Parliament at St Paul's would have had a stone of free speech, like the stone of free speech on Parliament Hill. And so there was a stone there, and its position is on this Midsummer Sunrise line. It's likely to be, if there was a stone that the sword was pulled from, that's where it was. And so we come to the end of this. Flying into the Earth Star's patterns is a dove, which is linked to the goddess and the Grail. And if it's symbolic of the energy entering that system, it's a very good sign. And I'll leave that up for you to read, because I'm going to finish now because we're running out of time for lunch. But I believe, as I said before, that a process of healing the wasteland has begun. And it's important for us to re-establish contact with the spirits of the wells, the Grail maidens of the wells, who are returning to help heal from their spiritual nature. And I believe it's all part of the fountain work. Thank you for listening. Through the park, and Camelot is hidden in woods on the north side, and we'll come to what it looks like in a minute. These are some photographs of it. It's almost square, moated island at the moment, in woodland. And it's been neglected for years, so the woodland has spread to the island itself. And I guess it's about 60 to 80 yards square. That's the southeast corner. Let's see what else we've got. That's turned out very, very dark, unfortunately. What you can nearly see there is an old hornbeam tree on the corner of the moat, which is known locally as the Merlin tree. And I haven't been able to find out why it's called the Merlin tree, although if you visit the place, there are lots of spots around the moated island where there's a very distinct presences, and I assume somebody finds that there's a Merlin presence by this tree. That's the north side of the moat. As you can see, it's quite wide, and in the winter, I guess suggests that it might be Cadbury Castle in Somerset, which he got from local folklore from the nearby villages. And then, of course, there's Tintagel down in Cornwall, which is one of the Camelot locations that captures popular imagination. But Geoffrey Ashe, who's one of the leading authorities on the Arthurian mysteries, regards Camelot as a mythical place that doesn't exist physically, that it's a visionary place. And he actually is quoted as saying that it can't be found on any map, but unfortunately, poor old Geoffrey, I'm going to have to disprove that today for him. Because we come to this map I found in the local history book of Enfield. It clearly shows a place called Camelot, right in the middle of what was the royal hunting ground of the Plantagenet kings, Enfield Chase. And it's a slightly different map from the same book, but Camelot is very prominent in it. In fact, there were 5 lodges for the hunting ground, each of them positioned in the 4 quarters: North Lodge, South Lodge, East Lodge, West Lodge, and Camelot was the central one. Prior to the Norman conquest, this land was in the hands of somebody called Ansgar, whose title was Stalker to the King, which was kind of like a field marshal. He was in charge of the armies, and he, on behalf of Harold, staged the defences of London and marched with an army of men from London to Hastings to get duffed up by William the Conqueror. Because of his role as being in charge of the defences of London, this is very likely a strategic military position from Roman times, one of the outer defensive positions of the city. And that's not just my opinion, that's again, that's something I've got from one of the local historians. This is where it is today. This is Trent Park in Cockfosters, which is at the far end of the Piccadilly line, so you can now get to Camelot on the tube. And Cockfosters tube's there. You come out of the station and turn right, walk up, and then Dreams of Knowledge. Yes, I've got. So we come to there are lots of Camelots. I'm not saying this is exclusively the Camelot, and none of the others are any good. There are Camelots all over the place, and one of them was in Essex, where in fact Colchester bore the name, pre-Roman name Camelodunum, and was that's as close to the Celtic name for Camelot as you get. So it has a strong claim to the idea of Camelot. Thomas Mallory in the Mort d'Arthur seemed to be convinced that Camelot was Winchester. Although when Caxton printed it for him, Caxton put in his own notes to say, "Don't be daft, everybody knows it's in Wales." Or, not those exact words, but I think that's what he meant. And he meant Caerleon, the city of the legions. John Leyland was Henry VIII's antiquarian, and he was the first person. What you're getting today is what I've found from my own researches. And the particular Camelot we're talking about is one of the sites that initiated my Earth stars discovery 20 years ago. So I've been accumulating the facts on this for the last 20 years, and finally got round to doing something with them. As you can see from that, we're talking about a place in North London. And it was actually the very centre of the Plantagenet king's royal hunting ground, Enfield Chase.
Where in North London?
Oh, yes, I'll be coming to that, obviously. Some of you may be aware of this sort of thought. The Arthurian legends, I think, were the Da Vinci Code of their time, and they caught the imagination of the spirit of the times. And they embody a living mystery tradition that's specific to Britain, and it's knowledge that is encoded in the landscape and the sacred sites. And those of you who are involved in traditional spiritual paths of these islands, the Druid tradition or the Western mystery tradition, will be aware of that because it's something that's taught in those